So the Withdrawal Agreement, or WAB, passed its second reading on Tuesday.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time.
The ayes to the right, 329. The noes to the left, 299.
So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlock.
And it's looking like this might be the deal that the UK ends up leaving the EU with. It's a massive 115-page bill with 126 pages of explanatory notes that the government originally wanted to push through Parliament in a couple of days. The programme motion detailing this speedy passage was defeated in the Commons on Tuesday because MPs wanted longer to scrutinise the bill. Just for reference, other EU treaties like this one have been debated for between 10 and 30 days in the Commons. The Treaty of Lisbon took 11, Maastricht took 28, and the Treaty of Rome 30. In fact, the EU Withdrawal Act of 2018 required 17 days in the Commons, with 21 further days in the Lords, and that was spread out over a period of 9 months. The point is, this simply wasn't enough time to properly scrutinise the bill. Some Conservatives saw this as parliamentary hypocrisy, because Parliament had rushed through the Benn Act, itself a constitutionally important piece of legislation, in a similarly short time. They've got half a point there, but the Benn Act was only 3 pages long, compared to the 115-page WAB, and the Benn Act was time sensitive, in that they needed to pass it quickly to stop no deal, whereas WAB is only time sensitive, in that passing it by the 31st of October would give Johnson a bit of political capital. Before we get into the meat of this video, a quick offer for you. The first 10 people to use the code COMMONS will get 10% off in our pin badge store. The EU and UK and EU badges have both sold out, and stock's getting low on some of our other designs, so be sure to grab them while you can. There's a link to them in the description. So, after the vote, Parliament now have some more time to scrutinise the bill. While they haven't found anything as controversial as they have in past Brexit legislation, they have found a couple of niggles. Though being less controversial than the previous Brexit legislation is a low bar. The Great Repeal Bill saw May trying to smuggle in so-called Henry VIII powers, which would have allowed the government to amend primary legislation without parliamentary approval. Anyway, perhaps the biggest one issue MPs have found with this bill is to do with the transition period. Under the current legislation, the transition period extends until December 2020, with an option to extend for a further 1 or 2 years. However, this extension must be agreed by July 1st, 2020. This might not sound like much of an issue, but bear with us. The new European Commission will only start working at the beginning of 2020, and if Johnson goes for an election like he says he's going to, there probably won't be a new government until January at the earliest. Given that negotiators have to be chosen, and negotiating mandates have to be agreed, this takes us to maybe as late as March. According to Peter Foster of The Telegraph, officials on both sides are clear that trade negotiation mandates and negotiations are very unlikely to start before March. Even if they did manage to start negotiations immediately in January, this only gives the UK and EU only 5 months maximum until they need to start thinking about an extension. In fact, even in the quickest scenario, where there's a November 28th election, which gives Johnson a healthy majority, and then negotiations start immediately with Barnier's UK task force, there's still only 7 months until the decision would need to be finalised. This isn't enough time to agree to a free trade deal. Again, for reference, the Canada-EU free trade deal took 7 years, and it's still only provisionally agreed. This is because it's what's called a mixed agreement, in that it covers both EU and national areas of legislation. If the UK free trade agreement is also a mixed agreement, it would have to be approved not just by the EU, but also by all 38 individual national assemblies within the EU. When Greenland left the EU in 1985, it took 3 years to agree a new trading relationship, and Greenland has a population the size of Loughborough and an economy based on fishing. Donald Tusk has said that negotiation and ratification between the UK and EU is likely to take between 5 and 7 years. Some people think that because the UK and EU are already so aligned, a free trade deal should be relatively easy. This is true, but given that the UK, or the government at least, plans to diverge from the EU, it might not end up helping that much. Also, everyone said the same sort of thing about the withdrawal negotiations, and look how that ended up turning out. So the government will likely need to extend. So what? Why are Parliament so worried about this? Well, because according to Clause 30 of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, the government is required to ask for parliamentary approval for any extension request. But Parliament themselves can't tell the government to ask for an extension. So if the government decides it wants an extension, it has to ask Parliament. But if it doesn't want an extension, Parliament can't tell it to ask for one. If the government doesn't ask for an extension, this leaves the UK with another no-deal cliff edge at the end of the transition period. But it'll be even steeper than last time, because Parliament won't have the option to unilaterally revoke Article 50 as a last resort. Also, this extension is going to be more controversial than the others. The UK's financial contributions to the EU are covered by the current Multi-Annual Financial Framework, or MFF, that runs through until December 2020. Previous extensions, like the one from March 29th to October 31st, and the Ben Act one that Donald Tusk is currently discussing, have just assumed that the UK will continue with its current financial obligations, as described in the latest version of the Multi-Annual Financial Framework. MFF cycles cover 7 years, and the current MFF cycle began in 2014. For those of you who can do basic arithmetic, you might have realised that that means that the next MFF cycle will start in 2021. Therefore, any extension past December 2020 will need the UK to agree to a new set of financial obligations. In fact, that's why the UK has to ask for an extension before July 2020, to give the EU enough time to incorporate it into the next multi-annual financial framework if necessary. Currently, the UK gets a pretty significant rebate on its financial contributions. The EU are going to have to decide if they still want to grant a rebate to a country that's trying to leave, and furthermore, how long they include the UK in their MFF calculations. If they assume that the UK will stick around for the whole 7 years, and then the UK leaves all of a sudden after 6 months, the EU are left with a gaping black hole in their budgets. Equally, if they assume that the UK is only going to stick it out for a year, and they end up hanging on for the whole 7 years, then they'll have to constantly renegotiate their financial contributions. On the UK side, whoever's Prime Minister at the time will have a difficult job selling it to the Brexiteers. Everyone thought Brexit was going to be done and dusted with the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, but it might turn out that the UK still has to pay the EU, and potentially even more money than before. So for those of you who are worried that TLDR might collapse at the end of Brexit, don't worry, it literally never ends. Anyway, this is why Parliament's so worried. They know that the government will need an extension, but any extension will require them to commit more money to the EU. This might be enough to push Johnson, or whoever's Prime Minister, into going for a no deal, and currently, the Withdrawal Agreement Bill doesn't provide Parliament with any means to stop this. MP Nick Bowles has published an amendment which would force the government to seek an extension until 2022 to try and avoid this. Even if this amendment doesn't make it, maybe Parliament doesn't need to be so worried. Assuming the next speaker follows the conventions set by Bercow, Parliament will likely still be able to assert itself in the future, like it's been able to do recently with the Ben Act. If there's a strong parliamentary majority for an extension when it comes round to it, they can probably do it.
Point of order, Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday, this House emphatically rejected the Prime Minister's deal. Tonight, the House has refused to be bounced into debating a hugely significant piece of legislation in just 2 days, with barely any notice and an analysis of the economic impact of this bill. The Prime Minister is the author of his own misfortune.
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The facts of the matter are this is yet another humiliating defeat for the Prime Minister this evening, who has sought to railroad through this House legislation that requires proper scrutiny. And rightly, this House has spoken with a very clear voice to tell the Prime Minister he is not on.
Meanwhile, point of order, Jace Winson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Twice in the last 3 days, the Prime Minister has failed to force his bad Brexit deal through this House without adequate scrutiny. Is it not time to end the brinksmanship and replace it with some statesmanship, to seriously and respectfully engage with our European friends to secure an extension to Article 50 to enable this House to pass legislation for a people's vote, or, if he prefers, to have proper proper scrutiny of his bill, or indeed it may well be for a general election. All of those things require a decent extension to Article 50. He should be a statesman and go and secure it.
If you want to be updated on this story, whether that's things happening this month, next year, or in 2022, be sure to subscribe to the channel. You can also hit the bell icon if you want to be notified every time we release a video. And if you want more from us, you can find TLDR across all social networks simply by searching for TLDR News. And if you want your name featured at the end of the videos, just like these people, then you can sign up to back us on Patreon. There's a link to that in the description.